6 June 1944, 03:47 am. St. Miss-Église, Normandy, France, Private First Class Donald Metz of the 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment, 82nd Airborne Division, is pressed flat against a stone wall that smells of wet chalk and somebody else's blood. He has been in this country for exactly 3 hours and 41 minutes. He arrived by parachute in darkness, in chaos, in a field he still cannot name. He found Sergeant Louis's career by the sound of a cricket clicker in the dark. 2 clicks, 1 click back, and the 2 of them have been moving through hedgerows and sunken lanes ever since, trying to find anyone else from their stick, trying to find any reference point that matches the sand table models they memorized in England. Metz is carrying a Thompson M 1928A1. It weighs 10.5 pounds unloaded. Loaded, with the 30-round box magazine his unit switched to after everyone agreed the drum was a liability, it weighs closer to 12.5. He has been carrying it since takeoff. His right arm aches in a way that he has stopped acknowledging. The Thompson is a fine weapon in many respects. Its designers understood close-range stopping power. It fires the .45 ACP cartridge with authority. But it was conceived in 1919, refined through the 1920s, and mass-produced in a world that no longer exists. It was built for a war that bore no resemblance to the one Metz is currently living through in the dark. It is heavy, it is expensive, somewhere between $45 and $70 a unit, depending on the contract. And every one of those dollars represents a choice that a government fighting a two-ocean war has had to make. He is exhausted in the specific way that combat produces, not the deep tiredness of long work, but the crackling, hollow tiredness of sustained fear. He and the other men of the 505th, who have been filtering into positions around this town, have been fighting for hours already against scattered German defenders who did not expect paratroopers here and who have been reacting to that surprise with violence. The paratroopers are outnumbered in most individual engagements. They are holding on the strength of surprise and confusion, and both of those advantages are burning down by the minute. At German 7th Army headquarters, that same night, the situation maps are being marked with question marks. General Lieutenant Wilhelm Folly, commanding the 91st Infantry Division responsible for this sector, has been receiving reports of parachute landings across a wide area and cannot determine whether this is the main invasion or a diversion. His training, and the training of every officer around him, rests on a foundational assessment of American infantry, competent, well-supplied, but ultimately dependent on firepower from above and armor for breakthrough. The American foot soldier, in the German doctrinal assumption of 1944, was not expected to be particularly dangerous in close terrain without those supporting arms. The hedgerow country of Normandy, the bocage, was understood to negate American advantages. It was a reasonable assumption. It was about to be tested against a weapon that German doctrine had not accounted for, built around a flaw that American ordnance had argued about for years and never actually fixed. There are 2 things wrong with this story, as it is usually told. One of them is a real, documented, mechanical flaw. A flaw that engineers formally identified, formally debated, formally recommended correcting, and then watched shipped to the battlefield unchanged because the mathematics of wartime production simply did not permit otherwise. The other is a reputation, a piece of battlefield legend that has been repeated in memoirs, documentaries, and arguments at gun shows for 8 decades. It makes for a better story than the truth. The question of which one actually mattered is the whole point of this video. To understand that, we have to go back to a small engineering firm in Hartford, Connecticut, and a former Army officer named George Hyde, who had been thinking about submachine guns since before most of the men currently fighting in Normandy were old enough to shave. Part 1. Hyde's other gun, George Hyde, was not born into the American gun industry. He was born in France in 1888 to a family of no particular prominence, and he came to the United States as a young man in that wave of early 20th century immigration that brought skilled craftsmen and mechanics to a country that had endless use for both. He was self-educated in the ways that matter most for mechanical work. By doing, by taking things apart, by understanding function before theory. He had no formal engineering degree. He had something rarer, the kind of mechanical intuition that shows itself early and consistently, that makes a man the person other people bring their problems to. By the time the United States entered the Second World War, Hyde was already in his early 50s and already known, in the specific small world of American ordnance, as someone worth listening to. He had been working on small arms designs for years. He had produced the Hyde M2, a submachine gun that the Army evaluated seriously before passing on it, and the lessons of that rejection were not wasted on him. He understood what the Army needed: simplicity, durability, mass producibility, and the kind of brutal reliability that did not require an educated armorer to maintain. He understood, more specifically, what the Army could no longer afford to need: complexity. The context in which he was working matters enormously here. It is 1942. The United States has been at war for 6 months. The Army is trying to arm, equip, and train a force that will expand from a few 100,000 men to something approaching 12 million. The Thompson submachine gun, the weapon Donald Metz is carrying in that hedgerow, costs between $45 and $70 to manufacture, depending on contract and configuration. It requires significant machining time. It is a precision instrument built to the tolerances of peacetime production. The Army is using Thompsons as fast as factories can make them, but the production rate cannot keep pace with the size of the force being built. In late 1942, Hyde approached the Army with a new design. He was working in collaboration with Frederick Sampson of General Motors' Inland Division, a pairing that tells you everything about what this weapon was intended to be. Inland Division manufactured automobile parts. Its workers understood stamped metal, spot welding, and the logic of high-volume production lines. Hyde brought the weapons design. Inland brought the manufacturing philosophy. The weapon they produced together was formally designated the United States submachine gun. Caliber .45, M3, its unofficial name arrived almost immediately, given by soldiers who looked at it and saw not a precision military instrument, but a tool from a mechanic's workbench, the grease gun. It was ugly. That was intentional. It had almost no machined parts. Its receiver was a stamped steel tube. Its barrel was pressed rather than machined. Its stock was a simple wireframe that folded for storage and extended for use. Where the Thompson had cost $45 to $70 and required hundreds of machining operations, the M3 cost approximately $15 and could be assembled largely by workers with no particular firearms experience. The Army adopted it in December 1942. By February 1944, Inland Division was producing more than 4,000 per day, and in the testing reports from late 1942 and early 1943, buried in the formal language of Army Ordnance Evaluation, there is a specific notation about a specific problem. The ejector, the component responsible for removing spent cartridge casings from the chamber after firing, was, under certain conditions, unreliable. The notation was clinical. It identified the conditions: sustained fire, fouled chamber, certain temperature ranges. It identified the consequence: stoppages. It identified the solution, in theory, a redesign of the ejector component, a modification that any competent machinist could understand, and that would, in the judgment of the evaluating officers, substantially improve the weapon's reliability in extended combat use. This was not the kind of problem that gets a weapon rejected. This was the kind of problem that gets logged, argued about, formally recommended for correction, and then, in the pressure of production mathematics, either fixed or not fixed. Most institutions, when they find a problem like this, face a choice between two paths. The question of which path this one took is not as simple as it might appear. Part 2. The Grease Gun's Unresolved Argument, 22 March 1943. Springfield Armory, Springfield, Massachusetts, Major Ralph Terman is not a man whose name appears in many histories. He is a small figure in a large machine, one of dozens of ordnance officers responsible for tracking the evaluation, modification, and approval of small arms designs moving through the Army's testing pipeline. His rank is not impressive. His office, in the administrative complex of the Armory, is not large. Almost nobody outside that building will ever know his name. On that date, Terman submitted a formal written evaluation to the Small Arms Development Branch, the internal document that systematically laid out what the testing program had found about the M3's ejector. The language was measured and precise, the language of a man who understood that measured and precise language was the only kind that moved through institutional channels without being dismissed. He described the ejector's failure mode in terms that a senior officer without an engineering background could follow, under sustained firing. Defined as magazine after magazine without adequate cooling interval, the ejector's geometry produced inconsistent engagement with the spent case. The result was a failure to fully extract and eject, leaving a partially chambered case that stopped the action. Terman's recommended fix was specific. He called for a modification to the ejector's geometry and retention spring, a change that would, in his assessment, add minimal complexity and cost to the manufacturing process while substantially improving reliability. He was careful to note that the failure mode was not constant, was not catastrophic, and did not render the weapon useless. It was a conditional failure, one that appeared most reliably under the worst conditions of sustained combat use. What Terman's report initiated was a pattern. Between March 1943 and September 1943, at least 4 separate internal communications, letters, evaluation summaries, 1 formal meeting record from a review board revisited the ejector question. The language varied. The recommendation did not. Engineers and ordnance officers in this period were essentially conducting a slow institutional argument with themselves. They all agreed the problem existed. They all agreed the fix was technically achievable. And they were all working within a production context that made the fix increasingly difficult to implement without interrupting output. Here is that context stated plainly. By mid-1943, Inland Division's M3 production line had achieved a rate of more than 4,000 units per day. The Army's total requirement, under wartime planning assumptions, was projected at between 600,000 and 1 million units before the European campaign reached its conclusion. To retool the production line, to pause, modify the tooling, requalify the new ejector design, and resume would cost weeks of output. At 4,000 units per day, weeks of lost output meant tens of thousands of weapons that would not reach soldiers who needed them. The ordnance planners were not cavalier about this. The documented record is full of people who clearly understood the trade-off they were making. This was not negligence. This was the brutal arithmetic of industrial warfare. A known, bounded, conditional flaw was weighed against a certain, measurable, immediate shortage of weapons, and the shortage won. What is less often noted, and what becomes important later, is that the ejector problem, precisely because it was documented, debated, and formally unresolved, was also formally understood. The Army knew exactly what the M3 would and would not do. When it trained armorers on the weapon, the ejector stoppage was in the training materials. When it issued the weapon to units, the field guidance included the recommended clearing procedure. The flaw was managed, even if it was not fixed. It was shipped to the battlefield in its original condition, not through ignorance, but through calculation. The original, unmodified M3, ejector problem and all, is now in production at a rate of thousands per day, and it is going to reach soldiers in every theater of this war exactly as George Hyde and Frederick Sampson originally designed it, without the modification that 6 months of internal argument could not produce. Whether that turns out to matter, whether the flaw in the field becomes the disaster that Terman's report implied it might, is a question that a hedgerow in Normandy is about to answer. Part 3. The grease guns Normandy before a single M3 fires in anger in Normandy, it already has a reputation problem. In January 1944, the Army Ground Forces Replacement and School Command issued a training evaluation based on the results of field testing in Louisiana and North Carolina. The document noted that under simulated field conditions, mud, sustained fire, high humidity, the M3 had produced stoppage rates that fell below acceptable standards for a primary infantry weapon. The evaluation board did not recommend withdrawing the weapon from service. It did recommend that infantry and Marine units be formally advised that the M3 was less reliable than the Thompson in harsh environment operations and should not be regarded as a primary assault weapon in amphibious or jungle conditions. The Army acted on this recommendation. Units receiving M3s were briefed on its limitations. The press, or at least the military press observers who filtered these evaluations, was not kind. Reporting in early 1944 described the M3 in terms ranging from skeptical to outright dismissive. One widely circulated assessment called it a field expedient that represented a prioritization of production economics over battlefield reliability. Soldiers who had trained with the Thompson read these assessments and arrived in the European theater with a clear institutional expectation. The grease gun was cheap. It was plentiful, and it was not entirely to be trusted. The 117th Infantry Regiment, 30th Infantry Division, arrived in Normandy in late June 1944, moving to relieve elements of the exhausted 82nd Airborne and other units that had been fighting without relief since D-Day. Among the men rotating in was Private First Class Raymond Kowalski of Hamtramck, Michigan, a factory worker's son who had spent 2 years before the draft working a stamping press at a Fisher body plant, and who, by a coincidence that would have amused him if he'd known it, understood stamped steel production better than most soldiers in the division. He was 22. He had qualified expert on the rifle range at Fort Benning. He was carrying an M3. The veterans of the units being relieved were not encouraging. The men of the 82nd who handed off their positions were gaunt, mud-caked, and operating on a combination of stubbornness and coffee that had long since replaced anything resembling sleep. Their assessment of the bocage, the sunken lanes, the high hedgerows, the distances measured in feet rather than yards, was blunt. Everything you trained for in open terrain was useless here. The Germans knew the ground better than you did, and the engagement ranges were so short that a man with a pistol was as dangerous as a man with a rifle. When they saw the M3s that the incoming soldiers were carrying, their response was a weary skepticism. Cheap-looking, made in a car factory. What neither the American veterans nor the German defenders across the hedgerows understood was that the bocage was, accidentally, the ideal tactical environment for the weapon that everyone had decided to underestimate. The morning of 11 July 1944 is gray and wet. Elements of the 117th Infantry are moving through a series of farm fields outside St. L, attempting to push through a series of German defensive positions organized around a cluster of stone farm buildings. The engagement distance, when contact is made, is approximately 60 to 90 feet, the width of a hedgerow lane. Kowalski is on the right flank of a 5-man fire team moving along a sunken road when the German position opens up. The M3 fires from an open bolt. When Kowalski pulls the trigger, the bolt travels forward, strips a round from the magazine, chambers it, fires it, and ejects the spent case in a single continuous action. The cyclic rate is approximately 450 rounds per minute, slower than the Thompson, substantially slower than the German MP40, deliberately slower than both, because Hyde and Sampson built a weapon intended for control rather than speed. At 450 rounds per minute, a 30-round magazine lasts approximately 4 seconds of sustained fire. At 60 feet, in a sunken lane, 4 seconds is an eternity. The German position does not hold. The rate of fire, directed at close range in a confined corridor, is sufficient to suppress the position without requiring precision marksmanship. The fire team advances. 2 other M3s are firing from the left flank, and the combined effect, approximately 1,350 rounds per minute potential across 3 weapons, is sufficient to produce what the after-action report will describe, in characteristically dry Army language, as effective suppression of the enemy position. What the after-action report will not capture is what the surviving German soldiers later describe in prisoner interrogation records, a conviction, in the initial moments of that engagement, that they were being engaged by a heavier crew-served weapon rather than individual infantry. The rate of fire, the sustained nature of it, the fact that it did not pause for the kind of individual aimed shots they expected from American infantry, all of this produced a tactical confusion that lasted approximately 30 seconds. 30 seconds in a close-range engagement in bocage terrain is operationally significant. The ejector stoppage problem did occur. It occurred twice in the 117th's initial operations in the St. L push, both times in exactly the conditions Terman's 1943 report had predicted: sustained fire over multiple magazines without adequate cooling. Both times, the armorer's clearing procedure took approximately 8 seconds. Both times, the weapon was back in action within a fraction of a minute. Word travels in infantry units by the oldest mechanism available: soldiers watching other soldiers. Within 2 weeks of the 117th's initial contact operations, men from adjacent units, the 119th Infantry, the 120th Infantry, were making informal requests to exchange Thompsons for M3s. Not because anyone had issued a formal revaluation, because they had watched the weapon work at the distances and in the terrain where they were actually fighting. 3 soldiers from the 120th Infantry are documented, in their unit's morning reports, as having declined to exchange their personally acquired M3s when resupply brought new Thompsons forward. This is not the behavior of men carrying a weapon they distrust. This is the behavior of men who have decided, on the basis of observation, that the institutional assessment was wrong. The German 17th SS Panzergrenadier Division engaged against American infantry in this same sector throughout July 1944, produced a post-engagement assessment that was captured and translated by Army intelligence. The assessment noted, with some puzzlement, that American infantry in the Bocage terrain appeared to be equipped with a higher density of automatic weapons than German doctrine assumed. It recommended that unit commanders account for a higher than expected volume of automatic fire in close terrain engagements. The M3 had, by being misidentified as something heavier than it was, caused a formal revision in enemy doctrine. The St. L breakthrough, when it came on 25 July 1944, involved hundreds of M3-equipped infantry soldiers in the closed terrain clearing operations that preceded the armor exploitation. The position held, the advance continued, and nobody wrote a press release about a cheap stamped steel submachine gun with a documented ejector flaw. Part 4. The legend of the click here is the story as it is usually told. The M3 grease gun, the legend goes, had a unique and dangerous habit. It could fire if dropped. The open bolt design, in the version most commonly repeated, meant that a sharp impact, a soldier stumbling, a weapon hitting the ground, could drive the bolt forward under inertia, strip around, and fire without anyone pulling the trigger. German soldiers, the legend continues, learned to listen for the distinctive sound of a dropped M3 and would use it as a targeting cue. The weapon was, in this telling, a liability that soldiers carried despite its danger rather than because of its reliability. This story is seductive because it contains a real mechanical truth at its core. The M3 does fire from an open bolt. An open bolt design does, in theory, carry some risk of inertia discharge if the bolt is held in place only by its return spring and an impact exceeds the spring tension. These are not fabrications. They are accurate descriptions of a real mechanical principle. What the legend builds on that real foundation is considerably less solid. Consider the acoustic argument first. The Bocage fighting of Normandy and most of the close terrain combat where the M3 was used intensively was not a quiet environment. Artillery preparation, American, German, both, was nearly continuous during the St. L offensive. Mortar fire, rifle fire, the distinctive sound of German MG-42 machine guns at their cyclic rate of 200 rounds per minute, the acoustic environment of a Norman hedgerow in July 1944 was saturated with sound. The proposition that a German soldier in a defensive position, under fire, with the MG-42 firing somewhere in his immediate vicinity, could distinguish the specific sound of a dropped M3 at combat distance, say 30 to 60 feet, and react tactically to that information, strains credulity in proportion to how carefully you think about the actual noise environment. Consider the timing argument second. Even in a scenario where a German soldier did hear and correctly identify the sound of a dropped weapon, the available reaction time is measured in fractions of a second. Taking a tactically useful action, redirecting fire, throwing a grenade, communicating to a neighboring position, in that window, in the confusion of active close-range combat, is not impossible, but it is not the systematic tactical advantage the legend implies. The documentary record is more prosaic. The U.S. Army's Small Arms Firing Manual, as updated to address the M3 in 1944, does include a specific safety notation about carrying the weapon with the ejection port cover closed, a feature specifically designed to prevent inertia discharge. The cover locks the bolt in its rear position when closed. The Army's own assessment of the inertia discharge risk was that it was manageable through standard carry discipline, not that it was an inherent flaw to be accepted. The cover is mentioned in captured German intelligence assessments of American small arms from this period, but the assessments treated as a technical description of the weapon, not as a tactical vulnerability to be exploited. Jonathan Ferguson, keeper of firearms and artillery at the Royal Armouries in Leeds, who has published extensively on the documentary record of World War II small arms, has noted in his research that the tactical exploitation of adversary weapon drop sounds belongs to a category of battlefield folklore that appears across multiple weapons and multiple theaters. It is a story that seems to generate itself in conditions of extreme stress, where soldiers are trying to develop any additional information source they can. It is a human response to the insufficiency of military training to cover every possible variable of combat. Under sustained fear, soldiers catalog everything. They develop theories. Some of those theories become legends. That process is not stupidity. It is survival instinct operating under conditions that human beings were not designed to endure. Which brings us to the thesis of this video, stated plainly. The real flaw in the M3, the ejector problem identified by Major Terman in March 1943, argued about across 6 months of formal internal correspondence, never corrected, and shipped to the battlefield in its original condition, was real, documented, bounded, and managed. It produced stoppages under specific conditions. Those conditions occurred in combat. The stoppages were cleared in seconds. The weapon continued to function. The Army knew about this problem before the weapon was issued, had argued about it formally, had made a deliberate, documented decision to accept it in exchange for production continuity, and had built the clearing procedure into armorer training. The imagined flaw, the inertia discharge, the legendary sound, the German tactical doctrine supposedly built around listening for dropped American weapons, was never formally raised as an operational concern by any Army ordnance document that has entered the historical record. It was not in the training manuals as a concern to be managed. It was not in the prisoner interrogation reports as a systematic German tactic. It was in soldier testimony, in unit folklore, in the oral tradition of men who were trying to make sense of the most overwhelming experience of their lives. The difference between those two problems, one that institutions took seriously enough to argue about for 6 months, and one that institutions never found reason to address at all, is, in the end, a portrait of a functioning ordnance system working the way ordnance systems are supposed to work. They chased the real problem. They didn't chase the legend. The fact that they couldn't fix the real problem in time, and that the real problem turned out to matter less than they feared, is one of the more quietly ironic chapters in the history of American weapons development. Part 5. The verdict: the largest single engagement in which the M3's performance can be assessed with documentary specificity is not in Normandy. It is in the Philippines. By January 1945, General Douglas MacArthur's forces were conducting the liberation of Luzon, the largest island of the Philippine archipelago, and the location of Manila, the Philippine capital. The Japanese 14th Area Army, under General Tomoyuki Yamashita, the commander who had taken Singapore from the British in 1942, in what Churchill called the worst disaster in British military history, had approximately 287,000 men defending the island. The American assault force, landing at Lingayen Gulf on 9 January 1945, numbered approximately 175,000. The fighting would continue until the formal Japanese surrender in September, with casualties on both sides measured in the hundreds of thousands, including civilian deaths. In the close urban fighting of Manila, a battle that lasted from 3 February to 3 March 1945, and that destroyed one of the most beautiful cities in Asia. The M3's characteristics were, again, accidentally matched to the terrain. Room clearing, corridor fighting, the kind of close-range combat where a weapon's handling characteristics matter more than its accuracy at distance, this was where the M3's weight, its controllability, its 450 rounds per minute rate of fire, and its 30-round magazine converged into something that soldiers found genuinely useful. The 37th Infantry Division, fighting through the Intramuros, the old walled city of Manila, documented the M3 as their most requested close-quarters weapon in the unit's after-action report. Trace the chain from the beginning. George Hyde, born in France, naturalized American, self-educated in mechanical design, spent years producing weapons that the Army evaluated and sometimes rejected before he found, in Frederick Sampson, an inland division, a manufacturing partner whose industrial logic matched his design philosophy. The weapon they produced together had an ejector that Ralph Terman identified as a problem in March 1943. Terman was right. Terman's recommendation was never acted upon, not because anyone disputed him, but because acting on it would have cost weeks of production output that the Army could not spare. The unmodified M3, ejector flaw and all, went to the battlefield in exactly the condition it left the factory. In the bocage terrain of Normandy, where engagement distances were measured in feet and rate of fire mattered more than mechanical perfection, the flaw produced stoppages that lasted seconds, and the weapon produced fire superiority that lasted long enough to matter. In the streets of Manila, the same calculation repeated. The Army's own post-war small arms review, published in 1946, included a specific notation that the M3's ejector had, in combat experience, proven less problematic than pre-deployment testing predicted, and that the weapon's simplicity and producibility, in retrospect, had justified the decision not to interrupt production for the modification. The M3A1, a modified version that addressed several of the original design's shortcomings, including a simplified firing mechanism that eliminated the need for a separate firing pin, entered production in 1944. The modifications were legitimate improvements, but soldiers who had used both versions in the field and who were asked about the difference in post-war oral history projects consistently described the A1 as better engineered and the original as more memorable. The weapon they remember is the one with the flaw. General of the Army Dwight D. Eisenhower, in his post-war assessment of American small arms compiled for the Army's Weapons Evaluation Board in 1946, praised the M3 specifically for demonstrating that production economics and battlefield effectiveness need not be in opposition. He was not writing about the ejector. He was writing about the broader achievement, a weapon designed around a manufacturing philosophy rather than an engineering ideal, that worked well enough in the environments where it was actually used to justify the compromises that produced it. George Hyde received a formal commendation from the Army for the M3 design. He did not become wealthy from it. The patent rights for weapons developed for government use were, in the arrangement standard at the time, essentially assigned to the government. He continued working in small arms design after the war, never producing another weapon that achieved the M3's scale or impact. He died in 1993 at the age of 104, having outlived almost every soldier who carried his design into combat. Total M3 and M3A1 production across the war and post-war period reached approximately 707,000 units. The design remained in American military service in various successor roles into the 1990s. The M3A1 was formally used by American armor crews, tank commanders who valued its compact size, until after the Gulf War of 1991. Today, collectors and enthusiasts fire original M3s at registered machine gun ranges across the United States, where the weapon's distinctive slow cyclic rate makes it, paradoxically, easier to control and more pleasant to shoot than many of its contemporaries. What this story says, in the end, is something specific about the difference between problems that institutions take seriously and problems that they don't. The ejector flaw was real, was documented, was formally argued about by real people in a real building on a real date, and was shipped to the battlefield unchanged because the war did not permit otherwise. Every part of that sequence, the identification, the argument, the failure to correct, the deployment, the performance, is in the record. The legend of the inertia discharge and the German soldiers listening for dropped weapons is not in the record in any form that constitutes evidence. One of those problems received 6 months of formal institutional attention. The other never needed any. The difference between those two responses is not luck. It is the difference between an institution that knows which problems to chase and which ones to leave alone, and that has, somewhere in its filing cabinets, a document written by a man named Terman, whose name almost nobody knows, which is proof that somebody was paying attention. Donald Metz, pressed against his chalk wall at 0347 and on 6 June 1944, is still carrying the Thompson. But somewhere in the supply chain moving behind him toward the beaches at Utah and Omaha, packed in cosmoline and wooden crates, stamped from steel in a car factory in Ohio, are the weapons that will eventually reach his unit. He will not know their history. He will know, when he picks one up, that it is lighter than what he has been carrying. He will know, the first time he fires it in a hedgerow lane, that it is loud enough to fill the corridor. And he will know, because soldiers always know these things before anyone tells them, that it works.